Several weeks ago, we reflected on a passage from the very beginning of the book of Job. The reflection centered around the question that we so often ask and we so often don't get the answer to. Why do bad things happen to good people? It seemed that in the first two chapters there was a resolution. One could easily just take the first two chapters of Job and run with them, leaning into the lesson that the question of why is less important than how we ourselves respond in times of tragedy. It's a simple lesson, pretty easy to wrap our heads around, but in the case of Job, he skipped a step. He felt the deep pain of loss, but something in that process was missing, something necessary and foundational in order to move forward. If we remember, Job's distraught wife approached him, asking him why, after all he had lost, does he not just curse God and die? Why doesn't he let it out? Why doesn't he shout at the top of his lungs and question all of it? Why doesn't he just abandon faith? And his answer, that it's reasonable to expect both good and bad from God, seems to be a step in the right direction. And in the first two chapters, it seems that all that is needed is a good attitude in the face of unfortunate circumstances. Now, there is truth to that, but it still begs the question, what do we do with all that bad? The remaining 40 chapters of Job reveal just how complex that question really is, and how his immediate response isn't the most helpful. Now, in my message a few weeks ago, I said that Job remaining dedicated to his faith was the important takeaway, and that's absolutely true. But the fact that the book goes on for another 40 chapters tells us that there is more to the story than just simply keeping a positive attitude in the face of grief and loss. There has to be more to it. There has to be more to the experience than just simple, positivity-oriented, bland platitudes. If we're going to be honest, the response that Job offers his wife, though well-intentioned, is a very bland platitude. And there's this concept that's known as toxic positivity, where focusing on silver linings or keeping a positive frame of mind is done at the expense of really tackling the trauma that exists within us. And Job's response is a perfect example. He tells his wife, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" It's an incredibly dismissive response. It calls her reaction foolish, and in doing so implies that her grief is uncalled for. And in this moment of toxic positivity, Job ignores her pain and glosses over his own in order to manufacture a shallow sense of peace in the moment. While his comment is meant to be a show of faith, it limits how faith can be shown. This limited response, this toxic positivity that Job is employing early on, is shown to be a weak foundation that crumbles under the weight of the questions that still remain in Job's mind. Unfortunately, just focusing on the positive and wiping away the negative doesn't mean it actually disappears. And it's unhelpful because it glosses over something that really shouldn't be disregarded, something that Job's wife was trying to focus on. If trauma is passed over in order to be positive, left to sit unseen in the corners of our souls, it doesn't do anything for us. It doesn't make room for any sort of healing. We too can fall into the temptation to engage in this toxic positivity. Dealing with negative experiences in life and the trauma that accompanies those times is uncomfortable. It takes a lot of work, and it's exhausting. It's far easier in the near term to just keep our heads up, stay positive, and focus only on that. But in the long term, it has a more negative effect. When we come to the point in our story that we read about today, Job is living that moment, where the positive platitudes he's employed have crumbled away, and the lingering anguish and trauma begin to reveal themselves again. And for all of us, that moment usually comes. Job, in the middle and later chapters of this book, dives in. He grapples with the difficult questions raised by his experience in a way that he hadn't originally. He knows now that he can't simply move on because this was such an intense and emotional experience, and it can't be just simply swept under the rug. Where before he tried to explain it away and keep positive as he'd done in the past, now he's come face to face with his own trauma. And how does he handle it? He laments. He leans into it. He cries out. He names the injustice of it all, complaining about how none of it makes any sense. This lament is a deeply spiritual practice. It's good. And it starts with the naming of that which he had previously tried to sweep under the rug. That none of this makes sense. This lament is the precursor to him finding a faith that is transformative and that truly helps him to move forward. Now, last Sunday, our church engaged in some deep discussions about our core values. We celebrated the ways in which we embodied them and how we've spread the gospel in doing so. But we also spent time recognizing the ways in which we've fallen short of enacting those core values. We also recognized the anguish that was caused in our shortcomings. For those that were there, it was transformative. For me, it was amazing to see how revealing and how challenging it was and how amazing the results were. Oftentimes, we tend to be like Job, the Job that we read about early on in the story. We tend to want to focus only on the positive, to wrap ourselves in a smile and push on through the moment. To do otherwise would be scary, and it certainly was scary for those of us who shared the anguish that they were feeling. Facing the pain, confusion, and grief in our lives is not something that we naturally go out of our way to do. And in a religious and faith context, we often put ourselves in a box where we tell ourselves that if we are not staying positive, we aren't being faithful. Job certainly sits within that box early on, keeping his head up, staying positive. And in doing so, he glosses over the moment in a small attempt at positive piety. But this whole book is about thinking outside boxes. It takes God outside of the dualistic, limited box of punishment or reward. It takes Job outside of his own box that said positivity is the only appropriate form of faith expression. It redefines what it means to be in relationship with God and how we talk to God in times of suffering. Job's experience gives us permission to be mad at God. It gives us permission to question God. It moves us past unhelpful platitudes that tell us God wouldn't give you more than you can handle, or God gives and God takes away, when it feels like you're drowning in anguish. And when we feel that way, no matter how well-intentioned those sayings are, they never really help. This book gives us permission to feel all the emotions that come with grief and pain and say, maybe even scream, God, where are you in all of this? God is big enough that they won't be offended if we yell or question them. God can handle it. The lesson of the book of Job is not that we must stay positive even when we are neck deep in difficult times, but rather to continue communicating with God through those difficult times. No matter how Job addressed God, whether in positive piety or in pained lament, Job did not stop talking to God. He kept challenging, he kept questioning, he kept yelling, he kept pressing into a fierce faith that led him through that moment of anguish. Job gives us a great example of how faith can be transformational and how true hope can come into being. While God never really gives us a clear solution to the question that Job lays at their feet, God does move Job into a place where he can move himself forward, shifting Job's ideas, shifting his way of thinking, and removing the old boxes that limited Job's ability to do these things in the past. This transformation was only possible because Job attended to his pain and grief. In this attention, he makes room. He opens himself up to the transformational hope that God has in store. Pain and grief can keep us stuck. While we may be tempted to keep our heads up and just move on, the pain can still linger, and we can still remain caught in that place even if we don't know it. Hope, which we seek in these times of struggle, can't truly be hope without acknowledging pain and grief. Anguish is the crucible from which hope springs, from which hope is molded. Lament can feel like the opposite of faith-filled hope, but lamenting, acknowledging, and processing our pain allows us to make room for hope and the transformation that hope has in store for us.